Movement detected.
Blip. I looked down at my phone and saw the notification from my smart camera app. Notification: movement detected in living room. I swiped it off and went back to work. I work medical coding on the late night shift, and the cameras have been a pain in the ass. Since I installed them, my wife and I put them in to keep an eye on our youngest, who likes to sleepwalk, and our oldest, who likes to slip out after curfew in reality. However, it's been recording the antics of our two cats after everyone goes to bed. I spent all of last week checking the cameras. Every time something popped up, now I've become kind of numb to it. I remember the first night I started getting warnings about it. My phone had buzzed, and I had immediately opened it to check the camera feed. When I say that my youngest sleepwalks, what I mean is that he plays hide and seek in his sleep. My wife and I have woken up in the morning to find his bed empty. Sometimes he's in the living room, the couch, sometimes he's in the storage shed by the pool. 2 weeks ago he was in the front yard, asleep in his playset. The officer who found him was not amused, since we had called them after tearing up the house and being unable to find him. That was when my wife ordered the cameras. We'd gotten 3, 1 for the living room, 1 for his bedroom, and 1 for our bedroom, where he sometimes sleeps. They were pretty neat. They are connected to an app, and you can see everything in a 180-degree angle in front of them. When something moved past a specific time, you get a notification to let you know to check the app. It all seemed kind of Orwellian, having cameras throughout the house, but I tried to ignore them. As I went about my day, my wife checked them habitually, even when we weren't asleep, and she had discovered that you could talk through them if you weren't home, something that annoyed me to no end. Blip. I looked down at the phone and silenced the notification. Again, at night I checked the notifications to make sure my youngest wasn't sleepwalking. Last week I checked the notifications religiously. I wanted to see where he was going, so I could call my wife and warn her that he was out of bed. I kind of wanted to catch my oldest sneaking out too, just so I could scare him by yelling through the speakers. Blip. To new notifications. I looked down and silenced them again. That closed together. It was always the cats playing in the living room. The first night I got 10 notifications within about 3 hours. I checked everyone, checking to see what had set the camera off. The first notification proved to be nothing. The camera moved to the movement's position, but no one was there. The second, one of the cats had jumped onto the couch. By the third, I was sure that this would be the one where something happened. I pulled it up and nearly gave my co-worker a heart attack. There was a face staring right at the camera, staring back at me through the lens. I dropped the phone and jumped back a little, nearly upsetting my chair when I went to look at it again, though I had to laugh as I realized my mistake. The face belonged to Oscar, one of our cats, and he was sniffing at the lens curiously. When I started to laugh, I think my co-worker's blood pressure probably normalized again. By the second night, I think I was already beginning to understand how this would be. The second night had 7 notifications, all cat-related. Oscar jumping from the chair to the couch, Chester, our other cat, getting a drink, the 2 of them playing in the wee hours of the morning. There was a rather funny bit where Chester fell asleep and rolled off the back of the couch, but it was becoming a little annoying. Even by that point. Blip. Notification. Movement detected in master bedroom. Notification. Movement detected in son's room. I looked at the notification, finger floating over the button that would show me what was going on, but I ignored it instead. My son had lightly left his room and gone to my bedroom. He did that sometimes, and it would have certainly set the cameras off. I went back to work trying to put it out of my mind. The next 2 nights last week had been the most infuriating. The cats had zoomed around the living room, fighting and playing. The camera pinged my phone every few minutes, roving from side to side as it tried to follow their antics. That was the first night that I ignored the notifications. It was just the cats after all, and I had work to do. Blip. Notification. Movement detected in living room. I had barely even reached to silence the phone when another came over. Blip. Notification. Movement detected in living room. Blip. Notification. Movement in living room blip notification movement in living room. I made a disgusted sound and silenced my phone. I had work to do and I didn't have time to watch cats play. I heard the phone vibrating for the next hour telling me about how there was motion detected in the living room, motion detected in the bedrooms, and then back in the living room again clearly. My son had left the bedroom doors open, and the cats have extended their play to the bedrooms. They were probably driving my wife nuts. But if she had enough of it, I guessed she would get up and close the doors blip 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 blip. I was quickly getting tired of this. The constant reminders were driving me crazy, and I was falling behind on my coding. It had to be the cats again. This was getting out of hand. I couldn't spend every night like this. Maybe if I yelled at them through the speaker, they would move off or settle down. It probably wouldn't amount to anything, but if nothing else, it would give me a laugh. I brought up the camera menu and found the display. That was connected to the living room. The hourglass spun as it loaded. And finally, I could see my living room in a soupy translucence of the night. Vision camera in the dim glow. I saw the source of the movement, their hand fiddling with the knob cover that we keep on the hinder. My youngest was near the door, was someone in a dark hoodie. Their back to the camera. I felt a flash of anger, so it hadn't been the cats after all. My teenage son was attempting to leave in the middle of the night to do God knew what. I couldn't believe it. How many times had we had this discussion? How many times had we told him that curfews were for a reason? And now he was bothering me at work because he wanted to go smoke with his asshole friends. Well, I put a scare in him. Get your ass back to bed. And don't you dare let me catch you up again, I shouted as loud as I could. When the figure didn't immediately act terrified and have a minor heart attack, I knew something was wrong. My son fancies himself a bit of badass, but he'd easily startled when it comes to loud noises. The figure didn't act surprised in the least bit. They just stood by the door, still as a statue, and I could almost believe that the camera had frozen. I stared at them through the camera for what felt like hours before they turned and began to walk towards the fireplace where I had set up the housing for the device. They were wearing a mask, something like a rubber animal mask that was difficult to see with the hood pulled up. As they got closer, walking slowly, as they tried to get a better look at the camera, I could see the long snout of a pig as it looked from the wide black mouth of the hoodie. He came right up to the camera, the eye holes blocking some of his ability to see, I supposed, and just stared into the little glass eye. He was still long enough for me to think I had lost signal again. And when he swung whatever was in his hand at the camera, I jumped back in surprise. The feed went dead, and I was on my phone to police. Before the notification dinged across notification, living room camera disabled. I'm in a little room now, one that they usually assign for people under interrogation. I don't honestly know what to do. The police have gone to my house, but I already know what they're going to find. I reviewed the alerts I received, the screen grabs telling a tale that makes my blood run cold. If I had taken them seriously, everything could have gone very differently. If I had just checked the cameras, I could have warned them. The intruder came in about 11:30. Just as the first notification came through, I watched him walk through the living room, Chester walking up the couch to sniff at him curiously. As he looked around, Chester was always a little too curious for his own good, and it was his downfall. Then the second notification had been the intruder as he stopped and looked at Chester, turning his head weirdly like a robot trying to loosen a stuck hinge. The third bing had been to let me know that the intruder had brained him with a crowbar before heading to the back of the house. The next two bings had been Oscar going to inspect the body of his dead friend. The man had proceeded to the bedroom I share with my wife. Then at first, he just stood there watching her sleep, cocking his head in that odd way that I was beginning to think of as a tic. This was when my youngest, probably after hearing some noise, left his room and headed to our bedroom. The next notification was a 20-second shot of the man standing over my wife. He had triggered the camera when he swung the crowbar down onto her face, bludgeoning her death with a dozen sharp strikes. I could see even in the dim light how the pillow she sleeps with over her head turned red. As he turned her skull into pulp, I could also see in the corner of the room my son standing in the doorway, watching all this go down. My heart leaped when I saw him. Was I about to watch him die as well? I couldn't imagine how scared he must be. He was 4 years old, watching his mother being brutally murdered by a man in a pig mask who had seemingly stepped out of a nightmare. I expected him to cry out, to scream in terror. For some reason, though, all he did was move as quietly as he could into the living room. That had been the notification. After that, the very next one had been the intruder, sticking his head into my son's room, tilting his head as he looked for him. Then he had triggered the camera again when he moved into the living room too. That was the second most nerve-wracking time. I could clearly see my son crouching behind the couch, knees to his chest, as tears ran down his face. I was crying by then myself. He must have been so scared as the intruder came into the living room. I knew that this would be when I watched him die too. The intruder should have been able to see the top of his head. The intruder should have been able to clearly see him crouched there, or hear his quiet sobbing. Oscar's body could still be seen across the back of the couch, but the other was nowhere to be seen. It was just the intruder and my son alone. When he stopped behind the couch, looking around as the crowbar dripped missily, I held my breath, but then he turned and left instead. The next notification had been to show me the intruder leaving to return to the back of the house. The one after that, the most heartbreaking, was my 4-year-old son dragging himself by sheer will to the cabinet under the sink and closing himself in. 2 of the next 3 reminders had been Oscar probably running to hide too as he zoomed towards the laundry room. If my son was making noise under the sink, I didn't hear it on the camera. If the man had killed my oldest son, I wouldn't know until the cops told me. The next notification had been when I was aware of the intruder, when I had screamed at him to get his ass back to bed. The last notification was when he had destroyed the camera. I say last because when I started writing this down, hoping that writing it down would help me keep it clear in my head, it was the last notification. I got another notification about 30 seconds ago. A notification that I don't know what to do with. The cops had been there, of course. They called and told me that they searched the house and found my wife and older son dead in their beds of my youngest. There was no sign, but they didn't find the intruder either. They believed this meant he had left. The front door had been open, and they believed they may have taken my son. They were going to start a search immediately, but I don't know what good it will do. Well, leave a few cops outside to watch the residents, but we want to get people on this as soon as possible. I got a notification from the camera in my bedroom. Just after hanging up the phone, notification: motion detected in master bedroom. I pulled it up and couldn't breathe for a few seconds. He was holding a sign in one hand and the limp body of my youngest in the other. The dark eyes of his pig mask stared across the miles and saw me as I sit here in this uncomfortable plastic chair. My son didn't look harmed, but he wasn't moving. And he is always moving. I had already lost so much already, and I was truly afraid of losing him too. The sign read, "Tell the cops to leave if you ever want to see your son alive again." I was abducted at a very young age. When I was 8, I was abducted for about an hour. I know that's an odd statement, but trust me when I say it gets winder. When I was 8, a man abducted me right off the street. My parents and I lived in a shabby apartment about a block from my primary school. Since Mom worked days and Dad worked nights, was responsible for getting myself to and from school since I was 6. I walked the same way to school every day, and if someone were trying to snatch me, it wouldn't have been hard to learn my routine. So there I was, walking to school with my Power Rangers book bag swinging on my shoulders, thinking of nothing more pressing than the math test. I hadn't studied for the night before. Suddenly a white van rolled close enough to ruffle my hair with their side mirror when a hand caught the handle at the top of my book bag. I struggled as the meaty hand lifted me into the passenger seat. but he pulled me up with little effort. He reached over to shut the door, his arm crossing right in front of my face. And this was the opportunity I needed to bite or kick or fight in, some way before he got the van rolling again. I found myself unable to react, though frozen by the ease with which I had been lifted from the street. As we moved away from the curb, I glanced at my abductor as he sat behind the wheel. It's funny how your mind always creates a picture of a potential abductor. When the teacher talked about strangers in school, always pictured a man in a long coat, a wide-brimmed hat to cover his face, and a soft voice with a gentle nature. On all the TV shows I wasn't allowed to watch, but did Child Toucher, were always these casual business types with vans full of candy and sweet smiles. This guy, however, looked nothing like the guys on the TV. The man sitting next to me was large, grey, and scary looking. He looked more like the prisoners on the TV prison shows I watched when no one paid attention. He had long greasy hair that was graying in odd places, muscular arms connected to a barrel chest, barely contained by his dirty sweater, and a pair of eyes that looked 1,000 miles away as he piloted the van on its course. I became terrified that I would never see my parents again, that I would never see my toys again, and that my parents wouldn't have anything to remember me by, except the school pictures ID brought home last week. It's funny sometimes the things a child worries about. "Don't worry, Mark, I'm not going to hurt you," the guy said in a gravelly voice full of mucus. I stiffened in my seat. "How do you know my name?" That was a stupid question. The man had probably been stalking me for weeks before making his move. He knew my name, knew my parents' names, knew my address, knew the kids I played with at recess, and what time I took my first poop every morning. He had stalked me like a hunter stalks a deer. And now it was time for him to move in for the kill because I am you. That took me by surprise. I had expected many things. I had thought maybe he'd say he was in love with me, to scream that he wanted to kill me, so I'd be scared so he could get off on my fear, maybe even that he would keep me forever, or be my new dad, and I would be his son. I hadn't expected him to say that he was me. "What do you mean?" I asked, visibly confused. He stared straight ahead, seemingly unable to begin. I thought again about how he was probably going to hurt me and leave me in the woods somewhere after he'd killed me. That was what the killers always did on unsolved mysteries after they killed someone. I bet he had a shovel or something in the back. My 8-year-old mind could already see him carrying my limp body off into the forest to bury me in an unmarked grave. The dogs would come sniffing after me at some point, and they'd unearth a perfect little skeleton in a hole in the woods. My parents would cry and scream, just like the parents did on TV. And Robert Stack would ask the viewers to call in if they had any information. It's funny the places a kid's mind goes to in time of panic. This is hard, kid. Now that I'm here, I don't know how to start. We sat in silence for a few more minutes before he found his words. "So in 40 years, humanity cracks the secret of time travel." He paused again, unsure how to continue, before finally settling into a rhythm. "By the time they do, you will have spent 20 years of your mandatory to life sentences in prison." I turned to look at him, unable to comprehend what he was saying. "Prison? Why am I in prison?" he sighed, fishing a cigarette out of the cup holder, where he had several sitting loose. He pressed the lighter on the dashboard and put the cigarette in his mouth as he waited for it to pop out again. "We've done some things we aren't proud of, Mark. We acted in haste, and now we must contemplate at leisure. Let's just say that you took the easy way a few too many times, and finally, it came back to bite you. The old neighborhood claims us all eventually, Mark. You're living in a septic tank, and it's only a matter of time before it pulls you down into the shit." The lighter popped, making me jump, and he yanked it out and pressed the tip to his cigarette. He inhaled and turned back to look at me. "We don't have much longer. Someone noticed me take you off the street, at least they did last time, and the cops are going to pull me over in about 10 minutes. You have to stop this from happening. You can't let the old neighborhood claim you like it always does. There are bad people there, people. that will be responsible for our downfall. You have to get as far away as you can. You have to get away and never look back. If you stay, you will be forever damned. Get out, Mark, get out and live. The cigarette jittered in his lips. He was shaking me, then yelling into my face and shaking me as the cigarette's red end swam back and forth in his mouth. I felt my head getting fuzzy as he shook me, and when the red lights started flashing, I thought it must be from all the shaking. He stopped, then turning to look at the lights, and reached into his pocket to pull out a glimmering piece of steel. It was a gun, a big gun, and when he stepped out of the car and leveled it at the policemen, they seemed afraid. They weren't afraid when they shot him, though. They yelled at me as I climbed out of the driver's door, but I didn't care. I held his hand as he lay dying. His face turned to look at me, and I could see that half his cheek was missing. His sweater was turning the color of autumn leaves. And when they weren't afraid when they shot him, though. They yelled at me as I climbed out of the driver's door, but I didn't care. I held his hand as he lay dying. His face turned to look at me, and I could see that half his cheek was missing. His sweater was turning the color of autumn leaves. And when he spoke, it was gurgly and wet. He coughed a bright daub of blood onto my shirt, and I still remember how it stood out against the bright yellow as the cops ran towards me. Get out, Mark, get out before it's too. By the time they got there, he was dead. My parents arrived shortly after I got to the police station. Mom hugged me crying, and Dad wrapped himself clumsily around me as well. It was the first time in months that I could remember seeing them together as they folded me into their embrace. I remembered thinking that everything was going to be okay. Avoid the scary man's prophecy and prevent the terrible fate he was trying to warn me about. How naive I was then. That night, Mom and Dad had a terrible fight. Mom wanted to leave the neighborhood. She wanted us to stay with Grandma and Grandpa for a while until we could find a different place. She didn't feel safe here, not in a place where people just got picked up off the street and nearly kidnapped in broad daylight. Dad wouldn't hear of it. He had lived here all his life, and this was where his work was. She was crazy. Maybe she could just go get another job anywhere. But he wasn't about to throw away 10 years on the job because she was scared. As I lay in my bed, I realized that everything wasn't just going to be okay. I clutched my stuffed Ninja Turtle tightly as they continued to rage at each other in the living room. The next day, Mom came to talk to me. It was decided that Mom and I would stay with my grandparents for a while. It was also decided that Dad would stay at the apartment. A little while turned into the next 10 years of my life. My parents got divorced a year after we went to stay with Grandma and Grandpa. I went to see him a few times, but Mom usually insisted that he come to us. When I did go to see him, she came with me. She still didn't trust the old neighborhood, and the few times I went back, I saw that it had only gotten worse. Gangs and drugs had taken over, and Dad had become a stranger to me when the construction company he had been with for so long closed down. He joined the element around him. Mom wouldn't tell me what he was doing, but I'm sure he was making substances now. The last time I saw him, he looked like a zombie from a horror movie. His hair was thinning, his face was gaunt, and he smelled like a truck stop toilet. He told me to stay in school and make something of myself. He told me not to end up like him, not to let people I thought were my friends drag me down into something I couldn't get back out of. Whether he knew it or not, he spoke the words that the strange man had said to me when he told me never to come back to the old neighborhood. It's a trap, son. The only thing it can do is ruin you. When his apartment burnt down a few months later, Mom wouldn't even take me to his funeral. I was 15 by then, just starting high school and ready for the rest of my life. My grandparents had money that I now understand that my mother wanted. They gave both of us the best life they could with my grandfather's influence. I got into private school after private school. My mother made it very clear that I wasn't to squander the gift they had given me, and I took her words to heart. By the time I was 18, was top of my class and ready to enter almost any college I wanted. College was where I met Tabitha. Tabitha was where everything changed. I went to a prestigious college, but I won't sully their reputation. By naming them here, they were proud to name me amongst their alumni. When I first stepped into their halls of learning, I took to my classes much the way I had in high school. I excelled, was noticed, and was praised for my hard work. I made the dean's list and was invited to join the kind of academic circles that would ensure I had my own level of influence when the time came for my children to attend school. I was as far from that sidewalk in my old neighborhood as I had ever been. Little did I know, I was closer than I thought. Tabitha was a year above me. She was a film major I'd met through a friend, and I knew I wanted her from the first time I saw her. My friend Jace was not what you would call centered on his studies. Jace had been accepted on a sports scholarship, and I had accepted that he was a burnout who was here to party and meet girls. Jace thought it was the height of hilarity to get me to skip out on my studies to hang out with him and his friends, and Tabitha was one such friend. It was she who brought about my return to my old life. It all started because Jace was in my room calling the person. He bought drugs from Moorhafucker. He yelled, slamming the phone down and startling me from my work. He won't sell to me anymore. He sulked, drawing his feet to his chest as he sat on my bed. Says my friends keep calling and coming by, and he thinks they're bringing heat around. Where am I supposed to get my ether now? Ether was a drug that was trendy on campus at the time. I knew it was amphetamine based, but other than that I had little knowledge of it. I didn't take drugs, I wanted to stay sharp. And other than the knowledge I gained from Jace and his friends, I was pretty ignorant of the whole culture. I was supposed to get some for the party tonight. Now I've got to show up empty-handed. A party, maybe Tabitha would be there. I wanted to see her again. But if Jace wasn't invited to any more parties, neither would I. I thought fast and realized that I might not be as ignorant of the culture as I thought. Maybe I did know someone. I know a place you could get some drugs, I said almost shyly. An hour later, we pulled up in front of my Uncle Randy's house. Uncle Randy was what I had always called Dad's friend Randall for most of my life. He and Dad had been childhood friends. Uncle Randy had been the best man at my parents' wedding, and I had kept in touch with him a little after Dad died. His house had once been pretty for a bachelor, Mom would often say. But now it looked run down and kind of creepy when we pulled up. Jace looked as if this was not how he was used to buying drugs. But I climbed out and told him to follow me. Randy was on his front porch and he looked rough. He had clearly been cooking for quite some time. Burn scars and adult acne spotting his face. His receding hairline had been scooped back until the shiny pate drew attention to the greasy ponytail that hung limply off the back of his head. He looked like every internet troll you'd ever seen memmed. But his Weasley eyes were full of dull hate and a bright hunger for whatever he could get from others. He greeted me warmly, but those eyes never smiled. We bought ether from him and were gone without much catching up or small talk apparently. Uncle Randy didn't have time for small talk anymore. The party was a huge success. Tabitha was there. And after Jace told them all how I had saved the party, she warmed up to me considerably. I didn't need the ether that she puffed into my mouth. With every passionate kiss I was high enough off. Just her being close to me, she spent most of the party with her hand wrapped around mine, her body pressed against me. We started dating after that. I wouldn't use ether, just getting a contact high. When we kissed after she used it, she called it ether hopping, and delighted in pushing the potent smoke into my mouth with every kiss. We started becoming very close as we spent more and more time together. I tried to juggle my studies with the rush of my first girlfriend. I had always been too consumed by this term paper or that collegiate essay to have much time for a companion with Tabitha, though I felt happy in her distractions and full of her presence. Eventually we graduated from college and moved into our own apartment. She got work as a columnist for a magazine, and I started work as an architect at a firm in the city. The money was good. We were both making enough money to do the things we loved, and we found ample time to spend with each other. Tabitha kept her drug use under control and I had broken myself of what little habit I had. Tabitha was enough for me, and I hoped I was enough for her. I was so naive. We had been together for a few years. When she started spiraling, she said that she wrote better when she was on Heather. She certainly wrote more, but probably not better the magazine she wrote for. Began to kick her articles back, not pleased with her work. This made her more self-conscious and made her use more as the money stopped coming in. She still seemed to find a way to get Heather. She never asked me for money. But I could always tell that she was just going day to day, trying to find her next fix. In hindsight, I should have realized what was going on. She began to be gone for long periods, always coming home tired and irritable. She was aloof and confrontational when I confronted her about it. She became aggressive and often combative. I never knew what to do with her. In these times, she was so removed from the Tabitha I had fallen in love with, and I didn't know what to do with her. When she became this venom-spitting demon afterward, we always made up. She said how sorry she was and promised never to do it again. Then we repeated the experience a few weeks later. The night she came home with the bruises was when I really lost it. We fought a screaming match like none we had ever had, and she stormed out of the apartment. I heard her car start up and leave the lot. I just sat there in our apartment, wondering what I should do. What I did in the end was follow her. I had often worried that her drug use might send her spiraling out of control, so I had installed a program on her phone that would let me track its location from my phone. I know this sounds invasive, but I was terrified that she might get lost or hurt and I might need to find her quickly. Heather has severe health risks, and the thought of her having a heart attack or something and no one being able to help her hurt me deeply. I wish now that I had just let her leave. I followed her to the neighborhood. I followed her to Uncle Randy's house. Her car was parked outside. As I walked up, I could already hear a low noise coming from the living room. The lights were off, the living room curtains drawn, but illuminated from behind by the glow of the TV. The door was ajar. One of her purple sneakers left across the threshold. As I pushed the door open, I could hear Tabitha's heady moans and could guess what was going on. Randall was her supplier when she couldn't pay him. She had settled up in other ways. Now she was in his living room, paying with the only currency she had left. I'd like to say that I flew into a rage, but I didn't. I'd like to say that I blacked out, but I didn't. I remember everything with crystal clarity. I opened the coat closet and took out the shotgun that I knew was there from childhood. It was loaded as it always was, and Uncle Randy had kept it as clean and oiled as the day he had shown it to 7-year-old me. He told me it was for bad people that might want to hurt him. He told me it wasn't a toy, and I should never point a gun at anyone. I didn't want dead. A lesson that came back to bite him that day. Tabitha screamed when she saw me framed in the living room door. She had been smiling moments before, sitting in his lap and writhing on top of him. But now all the blood had drained from her face. She looked like the corpse she would soon become. Randy turned his head, that greasy tail swinging. He looked at me in surprise, and I leveled the shotgun at the two of them. My face a cold mask of indifference. Tabitha said my name, mouthed it once. Before her perfect chest was a spray of blood, and the buckshot turned it into a pitted landscape of gore and viscera. Randy said nothing. The first shot had opened up the top of his skull, and he died instantly. She lay atop him, tears welling in her eyes. As she fought for breath, she fixed me with those eyes, as if to say, well, what else was I supposed to do? I didn't have an answer for her. I just dropped the gun to the warm rug and walked out onto the front porch to wait for the cops. I wasn't there when she died. I didn't hold her in my arms and tell her how sorry I was. I just sat on the porch and listened to her gasp out her last breaths until they were muffled by the sound of approaching police cars. I was convicted of a double homicide at the age of 22. I was given to life sentences and will never see the outside world again, except I will, I guess. I don't know how old I will be when the program makes me an offer. The self I met was old, but everyone over 20 is old to an 8-year-old, if I had to guess. I would say he was somewhere in his 40s, but that's just a guess. He told me I would be in prison for 20 years. I guess this is a fact that's set in stone as I sit in my cell and think about what my future self told me. I often think about what he said. Someone saw me take you off the street, at least they did last time. That leads me to believe that he experienced this when he was a child. Maybe I always go back and try to warn myself, and perhaps I always fail. What if my life is nothing but a loop of trying and dying to keep myself from coming to Randy's living room and ruining my life? How long has this loop been going? What would happen if I closed it? Would I simply cease to exist? I lay on my single bed, some nights staring at the roaches crawling across the ceiling, and think about the people who have brought me to this point. My mother, father, grandparents, Jace, Tabitha, Uncle Randy, and I somehow know what must be done as they all swim by. When it's my turn to step into the past, I don't think he'll explain anything. I might just take the gun out of my pocket and shoot myself as I sit rooted in the passenger seat and see what happens next. I've got 20 years to think about it. I guess plenty of time to work out the finer points of my own murder.
I painted something that shouldn't exist. I felt it before I saw it. I studied painting at the School of the Arts in Ishtar. I was in my 4th year and trained beneath a well-known artist whose identity will remain concealed for their privacy. I thought I had some sort of talent, that I could depict things that were better left undepicted. Those parts of you that you don't talk about and never will. His words, not mine. I didn't believe him, but I appreciated the interest nonetheless, given the fact that to everyone else, I might as well have been invisible. I wasn't creative and couldn't come up with an original idea to save my life, but there was something wrong with my dreams. They were always nightmares, every single time. When I was a teenager, a therapist convinced me to start recording them, but I didn't like to write, so I painted them instead, and that's all I ever did. Even after I told my instructor, his interest only grew. He always was a bit odd and seemed to think that I was in tune with something else, something beyond the sky, beyond the stars, beyond everything that we could physically touch. Before all of this started, he offered to guide me on a psychedelic journey, as he put it, to try and better understand my condition. The thought of taking anything always terrified me, even more than the nightmares. The thought of no longer being in control of my surroundings and the things that I saw. But unlike in a dream, this world could harm me. This world could kill me. But I didn't like to think I was a coward, so I agreed. That was my first mistake. I don't actually remember that night. He only told me that beyond a certain point, I seemed to lose contact with the world. I laid perfectly still on the ground, and I didn't say a word. I wouldn't respond to anything he asked or did. I just wasn't there. After the trip had ended, he told me that I left, and that I swore I was fine, though I didn't respond when he asked me what I had seen. For me, all I remember was waking up in my bed, back at home, feeling like I hadn't slept in a year. My skull pounded with the worst headache I ever experienced, like my brain was being squeezed in a vice. And when I got up and looked in the bathroom mirror, I saw tears of blood dry on my cheeks. I immediately thought that something was horribly wrong, and I started thinking about all the terrible diseases that it could have been. Yet, at the same time, I also knew that I was a hypochondriac. I almost went into debt from all the useless visits to emergency rooms that I had in my past. And it was never anything real. It was just my brain playing tricks on me. So, I talked myself down, and even though I had every right to be concerned, I brushed it aside and assumed that it was nothing. I came up with convoluted scenarios in my mind that could somehow led to the symptoms I felt, always trying to rationalize it. It wasn't sickness. It wasn't magic. It was psychology, and I would find a way through it, just like every other time. It seems so stupid when I look back at it now. The next morning, I was taking the train to school, minding my business in the second last car, in one of those backward-facing seats, because I determined that to be the safest possible way of sitting on a train. If you sat in a regular seat, you'd be thrown forward if the train came to a sudden stop, and if you were in the very last car, you risked being rear-ended. Sorry if I fall off track. I'm not in the best state of mind right now. Anyway, I was sitting in the back, looking out the window as the world rushed away from me, eyes on the glass skyscrapers that sliced up across the clear blue sky. There weren't many people around me. just students trying to get a half hour of sleep before class, or cramming in some last-minute studying. I still felt so tired from whatever had happened over the weekend. Not a regular kind of fatigue, but a dissociation where I didn't feel like I was entirely situated within my own body. Then, it stopped. A cold sweat began to cling to my skin, and a sensation of absolute dread intensified within me. I felt like I was in danger. I looked around me, completely alert, but nothing caught my attention. My heartbeat hammering in my ears. I glanced out the window, and that's when I saw it. It was so odd that I didn't really know what I was seeing at first. There was a middle-aged man, black peacoat and blue jeans, standing on the roof of a building below the tracks, the slanted shingles beneath his boots staring directly at me as the train passed him by. There was no reason for him to be there. He wasn't dressed like a worker of any sort, and this wasn't a roof that was meant to be accessed. He looked like anybody you would see on the street, but for some reason, he was there, and he was looking up at me, his face blank and expressionless. The train passed by him so quickly that I almost thought I was hallucinating, and I tried to look back, but the roof was out of sight. I glanced at the other passengers, but nobody else seemed to notice, even the few people that were staring out the window and should be rightly seen him. Once again, I rationalized it. I was an overly cautious person, prone to overthinking things, and I knew it. So, I brushed it off. I was sleep deprived. I was unwell. I was recovering from a psychedelic experience that I didn't even remember. So, I just saw something that wasn't there. Easy. Only there was still the feeling. It wasn't going away. I felt like I was flooded with adrenaline, like I was inherently unsafe, and I was sweating so much that my clothes were starting to stick to my skin. So, I looked outside again, watching the city pass me by, and tried to find something that didn't belong, something out of place. Everything was normal, but it didn't feel normal. When I reached my stop, I stepped out into the hot daylight, along with everyone else, and made my way to class. The feeling didn't let up for even a moment, and I found myself looking over my shoulder every chance I had. I made it to class, but I don't remember much. People were talking, and I was working, but I was just going through the motions. My mind wasn't there. I was looking around at everyone, trying to find something that didn't fit. But everything was exactly the way I remembered it, until I tried to look up. There was a sealed ventilation shaft on the ceiling, just an empty darkness behind the slats. But it caught my attention like a magnet. It didn't feel empty. I couldn't explain it, but it felt like something was in there, like something was watching me. It felt like I was in danger. So, I got up and excused myself. I left that class as quick as I could and stepped out into the daylight again. People were walking all around me, down the open paths of the school, and I felt like every single one of them was staring at me. I could never actually catch them doing it, but I just got this sensation that at any moment, somebody could come out of nowhere and stick a knife in my throat, put a gun to my head, drag me off into the bushes. It was the feeling of being watched, not just by anyone, but by something that means you harm. Like you're a prey animal grazing in a field, and suddenly, every primal switch in your body flips at once and tells you to run. I happened to look up at a tall administrative building. It was used to house the offices of all the professors. Through one of the windows, maybe on the 16th floor, I could see a woman standing perfectly still, staring down at me. She was dressed like she belonged in an office, like she belonged in that setting, but she didn't. I waited for what felt like minutes and watched as people passed behind her, but they never acknowledged her existence. She just stood there and held my gaze for as long as I could bear it. I looked away. I needed to go home. I needed to get away from there. I picked up the pace and walked back to the station, and all the way, my eyes caught on anybody who lingered just a moment too long. They would look back at me confused or turn away to do something else. They were never it, whatever it was that was watching me, stalking me. I got on the train, which was now packed full of people, though I managed to find a seat near a window. I wanted to be able to see it. The train started moving, and I kept my eyes peeled on the horizon of endless skyscrapers as they rushed by me. Looking down at any rooftops that waited beneath the tracks, I could still feel it. I knew that it was watching me. And then I saw it. We passed near a bridge of glass and metal that joined to shopping centers. And upon the swooping arches of steel that were fastened above it, an old man in rags stood in silence, his tattered fabrics hanging from his slender frame in defiance of the wind. He watched me, expressionless, his eyes shifting with the movement of the train. I nudged the lady who was sitting next to me and pointed at the man outside. "Do you see a man right there?" I asked. "On the bridge, standing on top of it." She looked out the window and then back at me, her expression alarmed. She shook her head and then got up from her seat, moving to the back of the car. I looked again, searching the landscape for the next appearance as the train began to slow for a stop at the next station. On a restaurant balcony, on the street below the tracks, a young tattooed woman sat at a table with two men, but they didn't acknowledge her presence. She was staring up at me, her mouth hanging slack, as though caught in a depraved, hungering trance. I got the attention of a father entertaining his son and pointed out the window. "Hey, do you see that lady down there?" I asked. "Right at the table with two guys, with the tattoos." The man glanced out the window, looking down at where I was pointing. "I see the two guys," he said with a shrug, returning his attention to his kid. The woman slipped out of view as the train pulled into the next station. Was I losing my mind? Did something happen to me? My instructor wouldn't be on campus until the next day, but I had to speak with him. He had to know something. I did have his number, so I swore that I would call him as soon as I got home. Nobody could see this thing but me, that much was clear, but that didn't mean that it wasn't real. The thought occurred to me that I could still be hallucinating from the effects of the psilocybin, or that I could even still be laying in my instructor's living room. Maybe I didn't remember the trip because this was it. Only, this felt real. This felt concrete, like I could reach out and touch this thing. I eventually made my way home, keeping clear of any crowds and training my eyes on every building I passed. Though I never saw it, I knew that it was there, but there were so many possibilities that it was almost down to sheer luck whether I found it or not. Walking out front, I heard the sound of laughter and clinking dishes, and saw that the neighbors across the street were having a small party on the bottom floor of their building. Most of them were seated at a table, visible from their window, but my blood ran cold when I saw a young, plain-looking woman staring directly at me. She was seated closest to where I stood, and nobody seemed to interact with her or acknowledge her existence in any way. I assumed that her chair was real, but to the rest, was empty. Others were standing. Every other seat was occupied. Perhaps they avoided it, but didn't quite know why. It didn't occur to them. Maybe this creature did exist and filled a physical space within the world, but for some reason, could only be seen by the victim of its malevolence. The only thing that I truly realized in that moment was that every single time I saw it, it was getting closer. I quickly entered my building and made my way up to my apartment. The feeling stalked me, even when I was in the halls or fire escape, with no possible way of being observed. If it had no line of sight within the world, it was almost like it watched me through the walls, like it crawled through all those cracks and spaces invisible to the naked eye, peering up at me from the subtle gap in the baseboard or the darkness beneath the radiator. I had arrived at my apartment, but I didn't feel safe. I felt exactly the same. I checked every room and every corner, every closet that I barely opened, and found nothing. But I had to be sure. Then I opened the blinds and peered out at the building across the street. I could still hear the party on the lower level, but my eyes weren't on them. They were on the man in the black suit who stared at me from the apartment opposite to my own. I shut my blinds, hyperventilating where I stood. I was too terrified to leave, so I didn't. I retreated to my bedroom, which was thankfully absent of any windows, and shut the door behind me. I made sure my closet was wide open and dismantled the frame of my bed so that nothing could fit underneath. I only needed a mattress anyway, assuming that I could even sleep. I called my instructor and tried to ask him what was happening, but he didn't know. He seemed to think that something was trying to contact me, and that the apprehension I felt may have just been a primal fear of the unknown. But I don't believe him. I know fear, and this is unlike anything I've ever felt before. It's relentless. It's my mind telling me to stay away. I could feel it watching me, even while I cried in the corner of my room, but I don't know how. There's nowhere it could have been, but it felt like it was everywhere, like it occupied every fleeting shadow. I looked at a picture of my family on my nightstand and saw a person that I didn't recognize. I picked up the framed photograph and saw a bearded man standing behind my father, staring back at me. I took a picture and sent it to my mother, asking who he was, but she said that she didn't see him. At some point, I called her and tried explaining, but I was too scared and incoherent to get anything across. She thought I was having some sort of psychotic break from the drugs I took, but I know that I'm not. This is real. I know it is. She called the police, and I know she was just trying to do what she thought was right. But that wasn't what I wanted. If the police came, they would take me outside. And outside is exactly where it was, where I hoped that it was. I don't know how long I waited there. Time isn't something that I have the greatest grasp on right now. It must have been night, because underneath the door, there was only darkness. Everything was quiet, so quiet that I could hear my own heartbeat. I remember wondering why the police didn't come, but I was so tired and confused and scared that I didn't know what to think. Slowly, I crawled to my feet and made my way to the bedroom door. Every second felt like an eternity, my vision blurring the closer I drew, like the entire world was caught in slow motion. I put my hand to the knob and felt the cold steel against my fingertips, every hair on my body standing on end as a horrible chill ran down my spine. My teeth began to chatter, and every muscle started to twitch with an ancient, primordial fear that crept in from the back of my mind. Then, I turned the knob and pushed the door open with a long, agonizing creak that cut through the silence like a knife. The darkness of the hall spanned before me, the air cold and still. At the end, a tall man stood in the shadows, his expression as empty as a mask. Wordless, he stared into my soul, and I could barely even process what I was looking at or how much danger I was in. I didn't have anywhere to run. There was nowhere to hide. I called to him, but he didn't respond. Slowly, I crept closer, my footsteps creaking upon the floorboards in the dead of night. It was like I was hypnotized, yet at the same time, I had to know. I had to know if this was real. The closer I got, the taller he seemed to become, every feature distending and looming, while my heart hammered in my ears and tears of blood stained my cheeks. Every pore on my body dripped with an icy sweat, and I could feel urine trickling down my leg as I stared into his dark and soulless eyes. His face started to change, roiling and shifting, like I was looking at 1,000 people at once, transforming between male and female, young and old, human and animal, to something altogether different. And the closer I drew to that truth, the more its mouth seemed to stretch, splitting open into a yawning darkness of teeth and fear that I swore went on forever. And then, I was gone. The next thing I saw was a light gleaming overhead through the blur of my vision. My ears were ringing, but I could hear the murmur of people nearby. I was laying on my back on a hospital bed, and my head was pounding with the worst headache I had ever felt. They had put me on some sort of sedative, and it wasn't long before I fell back asleep, whether I wanted to or not. All that I dreamed about was that man, cornering me in until I wanted nothing more than to die, until his jaws unhinged into a shadow so deep that even the memory of light disappeared forever. I could feel the cold slickness of his throat, the teeth as they cut into my mind, and ground my soul into a tattered pulp. I could feel the horrible agony of every single moment, until I finally realized what it wanted. I woke up, at some point, but I don't recall much. I said whatever I had to say to get out of there, anything to get back home again. I remember taking the canvas out of storage, and getting every paint that I had. I remember mixing them, churning them with my own blood and vomit and every bodily fluid that I could, until my palette contained the most vile shades that my mind could comprehend. I remember my hands moving across the canvas. I didn't need a brush, only my flesh, smearing and writhing as though caught in some unearthly trance. It wasn't in my head anymore. It's in front of me. I can feel it watching me. I can feel it cutting through my thoughts. It's eating me, and I can barely move. I shouldn't have done this. This shouldn't exist. I just want to die.
Lights out.
Come on, Bobby, how come I always have to do it? Clyde Arnott could hear the weight that his brother put against the pause button on the controller of his NES. The controller made that click sound that was somewhere between breaking and annoyed. It was the sound that let Clyde know that Bobby was just about done with his whining and would stop talking and start shouting. Bobby, for the most part, been trained to be patient lately. He was dating some girl who was really into good Christian values and just being kind to people. Bobby was really trying to follow her example, but Clyde was apparently really good at pushing his buttons, because oh brother of mine, you need to toughen up, or this world is going to eat you alive. Clyde felt a sudden burst of fear. Being eaten alive was exactly why he was afraid to go downstairs and do what needed to be done. Bobby laughed, not literally. Kiddo, I mean like if kids at school learn that my 12-year-old brother is still afraid of the dark, they'd never let him live it down. He'd be a social outcast. Unwelcome anywhere. I leave the job of turning off all the lights to you for that very reason. Clyde looked at the open door, as if he could already feel the eyes of the thing that hunted him and despaired. The house they lived in had been his mother's childhood home. She had lived here with her two older sisters until she went off to follow their dad. When he joined the Navy a year before, Bobby had been born when Grandma had died suddenly, Dad having beat her into the grave. By 6 months after a motorcycle accident, she had generously left the house to whichever daughter wanted it. His aunts had their own homes by that point, and the 2-story home, free and clear with no liens on it, had seemed like a dream. The first night they had been alone in the house, their mother having to work late most nights. She told them that before they went to bed, she expected all the lights to be off downstairs. I won't have my power bill up over the roof, because you guys are trying to light the whole neighborhood. Clyde had been assigned the task of turning off the lights before bed since that very night. This task had been handed down by Bobby almost at once. He got away with this because A, he was the oldest, and B, because Mom worked 5 to 6 nights a week to pay 4 bills and taxes on the property. This meant that most nights, it was just the 2 of them in the house, and Bobby was in charge when it was just the 2 of them. As such, Bobby usually gave Clyde the chores he didn't want, and that included turning off the lights. "Come on, Bobby," Clyde tried again, but his brother wouldn't budge. "Don't start, kid, you need to get over this. And the only way to do it is to do it, know what I mean?" Clyde didn't, but he nodded anyway. He took the stairs like a palsied old man, watching as the downstairs got closer and closer. As he came to the landing, he switched the light off beside the stairs and began. The lights, as it turned out, had to be turned off in a certain order. If you didn't turn off the stair lights first, and the lights by the basement last, they would all come back on again. Neither of them understood why, but Clyde attributed it to the thing that lived in the dark after the lights went out. He had named it Mr. V for some reason, and even he didn't know why. He supposed he had to call it something, and that was as good a name for his nemesis as any. Bobby just thought it was some faulty wiring and told him that if he meant to get the job done, then that's how it would have to be. You could leave the stair light on, the ones on the stairs. In fact, it was advised so you could find your way back sometimes. It was the best way to find your way back from the depths, and Clyde had used that light as a lighthouse more than once. He went into the foyer and turned the lights off, went to the mudroom and turned the lights off, but made sure to leave the porch light on so Mom could find the lock when she got home. Mr. V didn't care about the porch light, it seemed, and that was good because Mr. V could have a temper when he wanted to. The first couple of nights Bobby had gone with him. As long as Bobby was with him, nothing ever seemed to happen. The two went room to room before walking casually back to the stairs and up to their rooms. Whatever Mr. V was, he didn't bother big kids. Or maybe it was just kids who didn't believe in him. Clyde didn't know, but it was always different when he was by himself. He turned the lights off in the dining room, slowly finishing with the switch by the door so he could turn his back on the room. Walk out. This was part of the game too, and it seemed to make it better if whatever it was didn't see you seeing it. Sometimes the dining room would be empty when he turned the light off, but sometimes he would see a figure standing in the dark space. When he was done, sometimes it was standing behind the chair at the head of the table. Sometimes it was standing by the window, but it was always looking at him. It was never close like the horror movies he and Bobby sometimes watched when Mom worked late. It was never just right in front of him, ready to grab him when the lights went off, but it was still closer than he would have liked. As he walked towards the living room, he could almost feel the eyes of Mr. V on his neck, and it made him shudder. Clyde looked at the leather couch that his mother had brought from the apartment, her only addition to her mother's furniture, and felt a pang of guilt as he looked at the scratches across the leather. That hadn't been his fault, not really, that he had caused it. The pastor at church said that people had to take accountability for their actions, and Clyde was man enough to admit that this had been his fault. He had broken the rules, and he had to pay the price. It had all started very subtly. He would notice little things once the lights went out, and he would make note of them for later. The shadow man was one thing he thought of as Mr. V. Then there was the way the shadows lengthened and twisted sometimes when the lights were off. The whole downstairs took on a kind of puffy, unreal look after dark, and he had seen it swell or shrink depending on its wants. He still wasn't really afraid of Mr. V. Still did really believe in him, but he was afraid of the dark, and that made it easy to tell yourself that anything could be living in it. Even this mysterious Mr. V. He had spent weeks running up the stairs as he fled the kitchen for the living room. He had never felt anything grab at his ankles or claw at his shirt, but it had always felt like a close thing. The week before the incident had been a bad one. It felt a sense of foreboding hanging over the dark rooms, and it was making its way into his dreams. Sometimes when he dreamed, he would run through endless corridors, the shadow man chasing him. He fled. It was weird to be on the cusp of 11 and feel like you might be on the verge of having a breakdown, but Clyde was getting there. He had tried to explain it to his mom, but she just said that Bobby was in charge, and it sounded like he was trying to help him. Bobby was relentless when it came to ridding his brother of his fear of the dark. He told him how the other kids would pick on him as he went into middle school with his fear, how no one would want to be his friend, and that hadn't helped his anxiety either. That night when he'd come downstairs, Bobby was already asleep, and Clyde really didn't want to turn off the lights alone. He had turned off the lights in the foyer with a shaky hand, but then he had seen the shadow man, Mr. V, lurking by the front door, and his legs had started to shake. The man was looking at him, staring into him with his non-existent eyes, and as he watched, Clyde realized he was backing up. He was slowly backing up, making his way towards the stairs. When he dashed up them, he closed the door to his room and locked the knob. He climbed into bed and covered up, closing his eyes tight as he heard something terrible happening downstairs. Crashing, bashing, furniture being turned over, and all of it because he had been too scared to turn off the lights. His mother had woken them up when she got in, yelling for them to get downstairs. Clyde had still been awake and had suspected what they would find. "What the hell did you guys do? All the lights are on, the house is destroyed. I want some answers." As the two looked over the destruction, they saw she wasn't wrong. Neither of them could come up with a good enough explanation, and their mother had set them to clean it up as she got ready for bed. The house looked like a tornado had been through it. Books were thrown off shelves, the couch was cut and ripped, the end table was turned over, and the whole room was just an unholy mess. Bobby had complained about it, even cornering his brother after Mom had gone to bed and asking him why he had trashed the house. He hadn't been awake to hear the destruction, but Clyde had. He knew he hadn't done this, and he knew Bobby hadn't done it, so unless his mom had come home early to trash the house, it had to be Mr. V. After that, Clyde had been more diligent about getting the lights off, and as long as he pretended not to see Mr. V, he never bothered him. He shut the lights off in the living room, now the mended / lost in the dark, and headed for the kitchen. The dishes were in the drying rack, the sink gleaming after Bobby had wiped it out, and the chairs were all pushed in around the table. Clyde turned to look, marking his escape route in his mind as he prepared to make a run for it, and shuddered as he saw the dark head peeking out from the door to the den. It was waiting for him to turn the lights off, and when his hand shook as his finger hovered over the switch, Clyde hoped he had the strength to do it again. He pulled it down and immediately took off. He heard something come out of the den, but he was already running through the door to the living room. He bumped something with his hip as he passed by the couch, slowing him a little as he made for the stairs. It wasn't the first time he had bumped something, but it wasn't the pain that had slowed him. The side of the china cabinet had felt like Play-Doh, not quite solid, and it only reminded him that once the lights were out, it was different down here. When the lights were on, this was where he and Bobby sat and watched cartoons or MTV after school. When the lights were on, this was where he and his mom sat on the couch on Sundays and watched Lifetime. When the lights were off, however, the landscape was something else, a place that he had no control over. He could see the stairs, the light casting long fingers down into the dark, but as he got close, his greatest fear was realized. Until then, he could tell himself that it was all in his head. He could tell himself that this was just his imagination playing tricks on him, and that it would pass. Once he was Bobby's age, Clyde could come up with 1,000 excuses for his fear. When he was safe in his bed and the monster was downstairs, But as something grabbed his leg, Clyde knew that the excuses were nothing but a paper shield. The thing that grabbed his leg wasn't a hole beneath the couch or a toy that had been left out. The grip was iron, the claws were sharp, and when he turned back to look, Clyde wished he hadn't. The sight of that pitch-black face, undulating in the semi-darkness of his living room, was the most terrifying thing he had ever seen. The mouth was full of gnashing teeth. The eyes were like spiral circles, drawn by an uncreative child, and Clyde screamed in terror as he kicked at the thing with his free leg. It took the first kick between the eyes, but the second made the grip loosen some, and the third finally found him able to yank his leg free. He felt the claws scratch across his flesh, leaving 4 long marks, but Clyde didn't care. Clyde was running up the stairs on all fours, and when he came to the top, he looked down and saw the thing sitting at the bottom of the stairs. Looking at him, it didn't seem to care that it hadn't caught him. It didn't seem to care that he had escaped. The look in those black-on-black eyes let him know that eventually it would get him. Tomorrow was another day. What happened? Clyde turned coward as a new figure rose up from the dark hallway. He screamed again. Sure, he was about to die, and Clyde almost cried when he heard a familiar voice. "What the hell is wrong with you?" Bobby asked. Clyde tried to tell him, but he couldn't properly articulate what he had experienced. It remained one of the scariest events in his life. I survived an exorcism. What they tell you are lies. Have you ever hated someone truly? Hated someone? Do you know what it's like to be swallowed by anger, to fantasize and wish the worst possible punishments on another living being over and over and over again if you have him? Sorry. 2 years ago, my son was taken from me. He was the light of my life. I remember even now how tightly he held my thumb in his little hand when I first held him. His first steps as he walked into my arms from across the kitchen with those big brown eyes and that heart-melting smile. He used to drool on my chest when he slept, and even though he ruined every shirt I had, as I watched his little chest rise and fall, I loved him more than I ever thought possible. His mother, Elizabeth, my Lizzie, was over the moon when she saw him. If you think I loved him, you should have seen her. There's nothing in the world stronger or more beautiful than a mother's love. We named him Daniel after Lizzie's father. You should have seen how he cried when we told him. It was that first year hit us harder than most. You underestimate how much money it takes to raise another person, and when doctor visits and babysitting fees start to stack up, you realize just how expensive existing is. On top of bills and necessities, Lizzie had a tough time recovering. Postpartum depression swallowed her whole. It's the stillness, the complete absence of light in a loved one's eyes as they fight that mental hell that kills you. It's knowing that they're right there, and yet a whole world away suffering silently. It's the quiet blaming on yourself for any little thing you do that you think threw them there. It's the slow resentment that builds and the guilt that eats at you because you know deep down it's not their fault. Lizzie was the strongest person I'd ever known, and although she would peek out from then on, she never fully recovered. She was thrown in a hole too deep and too dark to climb out of, so she tried as best she could to live in that darkness and make that hole her new normal. When her maternity leave ended, we had to leave him in daycare. We were nervous wrecks without him. I couldn't exactly keep him with me while I worked construction on the sites, and I doubt Lizzie's bosses would have been thrilled to have him manning the front desk with her, although it would have been adorable. Danny was a trooper, friendliest little boy alive. Although he couldn't talk too well, he was more than happy to tell us all about his adventures, stomping around town on daycare trips. He loved the park, especially after he was done on the playground. He'd feed the ducks and then sit to eat right there with them. He even made us pack a separate lunch just for his favorite duck on park days. Danny loved that park. I think he knew that too. I think that's why he let us find him there. I had gotten the call around lunchtime that he was missing. I had called Lizzie and she nearly had a breakdown on the phone. My supervisor tried stopping me, but when I explained to him what had happened, he let me go. I found out later that he had got together a few of the guys to help with the search party. It was 16 long hours before we got the news The police had found him stuffed in a ditch hidden behind the pond. They had to call in animal services to help retrieve the body. The problem was that whenever someone got too close, the ducks would charge to protect him. We couldn't bury him. Until half a week later, once his body was no longer deemed evidence, Lizzie followed shortly after. When they got the guy I pushed for the death penalty, the coroners had said it was as if his body had been scrubbed clean before he was dumped. The lack of sufficient DNA evidence to charge him with anything else, coupled with the fact he was a first-time offender, meant the best we could get was 25 to life. I was beyond anger. He'd get to spend the rest of his miserable life being pampered in a cell, being fed 3 meals a day, while I had to pick up the pieces as I buried my wife and child I had begged God for justice for. That son of a bitch, to get what he deserved, but justice never came. When I heard he was out on bond, I became obsessed. I felt myself going mad every day. That bastard was allowed to breathe another lungful of air, even though I was still living and breathing. He killed us both the day he took my Daniel. I died the night I picked my son up out of that hole. If he were a piece of trash tossed into the bushes. When the lawyers turned their backs on me, I decided to take matters into my own hands. The criminal justice system was nothing more than a circus act, and I was a monkey dancing to its beat. I took what little I had left over from the lawyer fees and bought a revolver and box of bullets. I only needed one for him and one for me. The night before I did it, I went to church one last time. Drunker than I'd ever been, I walked into that warmly lit temple and let the Lord have it. I'd prayed for his death day after day, week after week, but every time I did, God failed to deliver. As I sat on that pew and sipped that bottle dry, I told him that if he couldn't deliver me peace, then I'd find it from the devil. As I drunkenly trudged through that cold night, bitter and angry, I heard it. I heard the voice of a woman calling my name. I looked around, but I couldn't spot anyone. Still, I heard it clear as day. It followed me every step of the way home, and that night she visited me. I had been having the same nightmare over and over again since it had happened. Reliving that stomach-turning moment, I walked across those bushes to find my little boy face down in the mud. That night, however, was different. That night, I was reliving the first time I had ever laid eyes on my sweet little Danny. I felt the soft pressure as his little hand took hold of my finger, and felt that same happiness wash over me. For the briefest of moments, I knew happiness again. I was so enveloped in that warmth that I didn't feel her watching me. "As adorable," she said softly. She was dressed like the nurse that had delivered my Danny, but her eyes were black as coals. I was too shocked to say anything. In an instant, fear had gripped me tight. "I heard your prayers," she continued, gently placing a finger in front of Danny. "I'm afraid he doesn't work that way." I heard Danny giggle as he let go of my thumb and grabbed her index finger. When I finally regained my composure, all I could ask was, "Who are you?" "I'm someone who can help," she spoke, offering a gentle smile. "I was like you once too, not exactly for me. It was my daughter." I felt that same heartbreak that's eating you away every second of the day, that mental minefield that comes with every waking moment, and the monsters that follow you into your dreams. I know what it's like to lose your whole world. Tears had begun to well up in the dark pools of her eyes. I watched the tears silently fall as Danny wrestled with her hand. "I want to help you. I want to help you because I know he won't." My eyes narrowed. I knew what she was. I knew where she came from and what she wanted. And out of everything in that moment, what really scared me was the overwhelming sense of sincerity in her voice. "What do you mean he won't help?" I croaked finally. Even in the haunting bottomless darkness of her eyes, I saw sincere sadness dance across her face. "He never knew how," she whispered. "The night I found out the truth was the night I sold my soul. I made her promise to torture the bastard that stole every ounce of happiness away from me. The conditions of the deal were that once I allowed her in, she would be in full control of my body until either we both perished or she was exorcised." She explained that in the event of the latter, although I would be free from her, she wouldn't rest until she found me again. Lastly, She emphasized that my soul would forever be bound to service hell, that I would be disfigured and my spirit branded, unfit for God's compassion and entry into heaven. As far as I was concerned, there was no such thing as His compassion, and hell couldn't be worse than what I had to live through every time. I opened my eyes, I agreed and let her loose, and she would go on to honor our agreement to the letter. I watched as that stain on humanity went through every horror the body would physically allow. I watched for the first time as a soul was dragged and broken in hell from time to time. I still think of it. You're probably thinking it was torture, being trapped with a demon in your body, that once you sign yourself over, you're subject to the worst punishment imaginable. You'd be wrong. The reason it's so hard to exorcise a demon from a body isn't because they're fighting to stay. It's because we want them to stay. In exchange for your body, they create a reality where you regain everything you lost. Let me live to see a life that was so unjustly taken. I saw my son grow and I died a happy man with my wife alongside me over and over and over. I never knew suffering while I was there. I never knew pain, she explained to me. But those who sought the devil out willingly knew suffering he could never replicate, and that those brave enough to ask for his help would receive it in full, and so much more, that even though God never knew how to help, the devil wouldn't hesitate to try and learn how. The night that priest ripped that demon from my body, God took my life a second time. Ever since then, I've been wandering the streets looking for her. And as I walk those roads, I can hear it. When my soul was freed, I gained something I don't know if it's an extra sense or something that's always been there. Now I can hear them in every home, across every alley and every street all over the world. I hear those desperate prayers for help, prayers almost identical to the ones I sent as I boiled alive in agony those 2 years ago. The suffering pleas of the world are almost as deafening as the silence that echoes back.
I've been a search and rescue diver for 12 years. After what I discovered, I'm quitting. I've been involved with water search and rescue for 12 years now. I've seen a lot of upsetting and even unexplainable things in my time, but those pale in comparison to what I saw recently. Water search and rescue is often a depressing job. When someone gets lost in a forest, they can still be found alive days later. But when we get a call, it's almost always body recovery. People don't last long in the water. I can't tell you exactly where, but I live in a northern territory known for its water sports. Fishing, kayaking, diving, whatever it is, our waters probably have a solid reputation for it. Despite that, this area isn't some kind of resort. The waters here are cold and oftentimes vicious. Search and rescue operations here can be grueling and not many stick with it. There are a few older guys who have been doing it longer than me, but I'm one of the most experienced around. Like I said before, this job is more body recovery than anything, especially here. We save more live moose from the water than live humans. And when we get a call about a missing child, well, we'd be better off just giving our condolences. That's just how the waters are here. Our small town has one of the highest drowning rates in the country. But we look anyway, and usually we find a body. I've considered quitting many times in my career. Most people quit after their first recovery. In training, we try to emphasize just how much water can distort a corpse, but nothing can prepare you for the harsh reality. It's not uncommon for us to find bodies bloated beyond recognition. Sometimes they barely even seem human. A lot of divers don't last long after seeing something like that, but I continued to do it after all these years. I figured if I didn't, then no one would. However, the things I saw last week have made me reconsider that decision. I got the call around 11 a.m. A father had taken his 10-year-old son fly fishing. At one point, the father managed to stab a hook all the way through his finger. He went back up to his truck to get a first aid kit. The boy was gone when he returned a few minutes later. When I first heard the story, I hung my head in silence for a moment. It had been raining heavily for almost a month now, and the waters were running faster than ever. To make things worse, it was unusually cold for the season. A number of people had gone missing in recent weeks. Many of them had yet to be found. I had little hope of finding the boy alive. Me and a couple of other divers were at the site where the boy went missing within an hour, and a larger search and rescue team located a few towns over was headed our way. We talked with the father and even searched the forest for a bit, hoping that he had just wandered off. But eventually we realized that we would have to begin searching in the river. The moment I got in the water, I knew the boy was gone. The current was worse than it had ever been, and even I had difficulty navigating the icy river. We looked for hours in the surrounding areas, and even expanded our search once the larger team had arrived. The boy was nowhere to be found. I was surprised. I hadn't expected to find him alive, but I had at least anticipated finding a body. However, there was no trace of him. The sun got low and the air grew colder. We were considering calling it off as nightfall approached and resuming the search the next day when I discovered something. There's a lot of creek beds around the river. Many of them have dried up as a result of encroaching vegetation or man-made efforts to divert the water. We usually don't pay any attention to them. However, with all of the recent rain, I noticed that one of the larger creek beds had begun flowing again. A surprising amount of water crashed through it, easily enough to carry a young boy. The creek ran directly across a bend in the river, connecting it at 2 points. I followed it and realized that the boy could be located outside of our initial search area. As I approached where the creek reconnected with the main river, I felt a sinking feeling in my gut. There's a place in the river where not even search and rescue divers are supposed to go. It's known as Badwater. This area lies on one half of the river and runs for about 100 yards. It's near a densely vegetated area, so we don't often have to worry about people swimming there. But a lot of disappearances occur in the surrounding waters. Despite that, I've been warned not to dive there since I began doing search and rescue. Supposedly, the undercurrent is so strong that even the most experienced swimmer would be swept away in an instant. Don't go near Badwater. It was a mantra of the older divers. The creek ended exactly in the center of the Badwater region. As I reached it, I stopped and chewed my lip thoughtfully. If I went back and reported this to the other divers, they would tell me to let it go. They wouldn't let me dive there. But deep down I felt like the boy's body must be tangled up in some weeds nearby. If only I could find it. I hated the idea of that kid being stuck down there, slowly bloating and rotting away while his parents sat at home wondering where their boy had gone. Badwater didn't seem to be that bad. I had seen rougher waters before, but I knew looks could be deceiving. Just below the surface it could be flowing faster than I ever imagined, and I'd be swept away in an instant. Besides, I wasn't supposed to dive alone. I almost turned back, but something made me stay. I stared into the river for a moment, thinking about the boy. Then I put on my gear and dropped into the icy waters. The first thing I noticed was that the current actually seemed pretty weak. As a matter of fact, it was weaker than the rest of the river. The water was extremely deep there, and I could see only blackness below as I dove. I kicked deeper and deeper, thinking that the current might pick up lower down, but the opposite seemed to be true. The water was almost completely still. I went even deeper until finally green shapes began to materialize in front of me. I thought I'd finally reached a bed of weeds. But as I kicked lower, the truth came into full view. I felt vomit come up at the sight, an odd and dangerous sensation when you're wearing a scuba mask. Countless arms stuck up from the ground below. I thought I had come upon a trove of bodies, but the disgusting reality became even more apparent only a moment later. The arms grew directly into the ground. They even had roots that spread out from the base. It was as if someone had cut off hundreds of arms at the shoulder and planted them there. They were green, and I watched as they clutched at the water around them. They varied in size and seemingly age. Grotesque baby hands sprouted near the bottom, and they opened and closed their fists hungrily. It was then that I saw the boy. His eyes stared sightlessly ahead as those grotesque arms pulled his dead body downward. It seemed they had just gotten a hold of him. The arms yanked at him, burying him in the surrounding sediment. They pushed and writhed and squirmed until he was securely buried up to the chest. I stared in mesmerized horror. That was when the other bodies came into focus. There must have been at least 4 more, all in varying stages of decay. Some were bloated beyond recognition. Only bulky, white masses that protruded loosely from the riverbed. I once again felt vomit rising in my throat and swallowed it back down. The fucking hands were feeding off the bodies, using them as fertilizer. The moment I clambered out of the water, I tore my mask off and retched. I couldn't stop thinking about those disgusting bodies, those grasping hands. They were like some sort of carnivorous plant, yet they were so humanoid. I vomited again at the thought. I frantically ran back to our base camp and pulled one of the other divers aside. Moose was the most experienced person on our team. He'd been diving for over 20 years ever since moving here. I told him about what I saw. When I finished, he stared at me in cold silence. I told you never to go near Badwater. His voice contained an iciness that even his thick Louisiana accent couldn't conceal. That's what you're concerned about. I was incredulous. He placed a hand on my shoulder and squeezed tightly. Don't tell anyone else about this. If the others find out you went into Badwater, he trailed off and thought for a moment. Well, it won't be good. He shook his head like a disappointed father. But what about those things? I tried to keep my voice down, hoping no one would hear us. How many people have died because of those fucking things? Shut up, Moose said. We have an agreement. There's a reason they only grow in Badwater. Don't fuck this up. I started to say something, but the words caught in my throat. He was keeping something from me. He sighed and I saw something like sadness behind his eyes. Sometimes you have to decide between lesser and greater evils. Even the best possible decisions can still keep you up at night. He went silent for a moment and only stared at me. Don't tell anyone about this. Maybe one day you'll understand. He walked away after that and called off the day's search. Despite what I'd told him, we continued to search for the next 2 days. By the 3rd day, we called it off completely and gave our condolences to the family. I don't know what the fuck is happening. Moose has been acting different towards me ever since. There's an iciness to him, but every now and then he'll shoot me a knowing glance, like we're in on some secret together. I've noticed the other older divers acting strangely too. What did he mean by agreement? What the fuck were those arm things? I'm considering quitting and moving away from here. I can't live with the knowledge that those things are down there, slowly feeding off the body of a young boy among countless others. I wanted to just forget about the things I saw. But no matter how hard I try, I can't erase them from my mind. I'd like to think that I'm a good man, but there comes a point where sheer terror outweighs one's sense of decency no matter how good you are. I think I've reached that point. I wasn't planning on writing this, but more things have happened, and I found something horrible. There's no other way to explain it. I don't know how much longer I can remain here. I can't sleep anymore. I just keep dreaming about those fucking things I saw. I've been plagued by nightmares about them for the past 2 nights. It always seems so real. At first, I'm asleep in my bed, then suddenly those arms are rising up from the darkness around me, pinning me down and covering my mouth. I struggle, but they're so strong. I especially remember the fucking smell. It's like old grass clippings and rotten fish mixed together. The next thing I know, I'm awake, retching with tears streaming down my face. However, even those terrible dreams are nothing compared to what has happened in the past 2 days, especially compared to what I saw last night. I don't know what to make of it. I've packed my bags. I think I might leave soon. I need to get away from this fucking place. A couple days ago, not long after my initial post, I received a call about a body found near the river. I felt a cold sensation in my gut when I got there and realized that it had been found right where the boy disappeared. I approached the bank to see Moose and 2 others standing over what a body. Their backs were to me, and I could hear one of them speaking angrily. He was practically shouting, "Shit, shit, shit." It was Clyde, one of the other more experienced SAR divers. As I got closer, I saw that the other one was Ryan. I felt chills run down my spine. All 3 of the senior divers were in one place. I recalled the things Moose said to me last week as well as the knowing glances I've seen those 3 share. Something was up. "Do you think it was him?" Clyde asked. "Let's not jump to conclusions," Moose said. "I heard voices by the river last night," Ryan said suddenly. The other 2 went silent and stared at him. "The lures?" Clyde asked. His voice was hushed, and I could barely make it out. Ryan nodded. "Almost definitely. That breaks the agreement, though," Clyde said. "He's not supposed to use those anymore." "Well, he is, for whatever reason." Ryan turned to Moose. "Any idea what's going on?" Moose started to respond when a twig snapped beneath my weight. The 3 older men whirled around to look at me. That iciness was still in Moose's eyes, but I also noted a twinge of fear. "About time you got here," Clyde said from beside him, seemingly unaware that I had been standing there for a while. "We've got bad news." He stepped aside so I could see the body more clearly. My blood ran cold the moment I laid my eyes on it. I was already reeling from the conversation I had just overheard, and the sight of the body only compounded that confusion. It was Michael, one of the new search and rescue divers. He laid on his back in full scuba gear minus a mask. I moved forward and knelt beside the body. Michael was new to search and rescue, and he had actually recently attended a few classes I taught. Tears stung my eyes as I stared down at him. "What the fuck happened?" As if in response to my silent question, Moose spoke up. "For some reason he was diving in the river. We think he got swept up in a strong current and hit his face on a rock, knocking his air regulator off and causing him to drown. We haven't found the regulator or his mask anywhere." I continued to stare down at the dead man in front of me. "Why was he in the water?" I asked. The 3 men exchanged glances. "We don't know," Clyde said. "We think he may have been looking for that boy we never recovered." I knew they were lying. Michael was one of the most straight-edge divers I'd ever met. He would never break a minor safety regulation, let alone go diving alone in rough waters. It just didn't add up. Additionally, there was another reason their claim didn't make sense. Michael had been out of town visiting family on the day the boy went missing. Why would he come back if he wasn't even there for the initial search? He wouldn't even know where to look. I knew not to argue though. I didn't want them to know I suspected anything. Clyde and Ryan were unaware I'd been to Badwater, assuming Moose kept his secret. From what I could tell, he had. They acted as they always had toward me. Just then an ambulance pulled up. The others left me alone with Michael's body while they talked to the driver. As I looked at the body, I realized something was off. There weren't any contusions on his face. If the current had actually dashed him against a rock, there should at least be a bruise. But there was nothing. His face was completely unmarred. At that moment I noticed something strange. A bruise peeked out from the neck of his dive suit. I pulled the rubber down to reveal a splotchy blue and black mark that circled his neck. It looked like he had been strangled. My thoughts immediately turned to those strange hand things I had seen at Badwater. But if that's what killed him, then why did they let him go? Was it a warning? A deep sense of dread settled into my stomach just then, and it's only gotten worse ever since. After the ambulance took Michael's body away, I returned home feeling drained. I couldn't bring myself to do anything that day and only sat in cold silence. I slept fitfully that night, plagued by the nightmares I mentioned earlier. Most of yesterday passed in the same cold silence as the day before. I felt numb. The conversation I had overheard between the older divers kept playing over and over in my head. What did they mean by lures? Who was this him that they kept referring to? I recalled what Ryan had said about hearing voices near the river. That must be the lures they had been talking about. As I sat there, my numbness faded and was replaced with anger. Michael was dead, and it had something to do with Moose and his secrets. It probably had something to do with those lures too. I grabbed my coat and headed out the door. I was going to see what Ryan had meant when he said he heard voices. I wish I hadn't gone. I should have just stayed home and let it go. There are some things in the world that should just remain unseen. I wandered the riverbank for 30 minutes, hearing nothing but the sounds of nocturnal animals. I was about to head back when I heard something just out of earshot. It sounded like someone's voice. The sound grew louder as I headed up the bank until I could finally make out what it was saying. "Help, please, I can't swim." Instincts took over and I began to sprint in the direction of the voice. I eventually lost track of where I was and stumbled blindly through the underbrush, barely even using my flashlight, and relying on my hearing. Finally, the voice came from the water right next to me. It sounded like a child. I was about to wade into the river when something stopped me in my tracks. I listened to the voice carefully. "Help, please, I can't swim." It was the exact same words, over and over again, as if it was being played on loop. The tone was exactly the same every time. It didn't sound right. They were yelling, but it didn't sound like someone who was actually scared. There was no urgency to their voice. My heart pounding in my chest, I shined my flashlight along the river. That was when I saw it. A face pressed out of the mud of the riverbank. Like the hands I'd seen, it was seaweed green and roots grew from its edges and into the surrounding earth. It was like someone had constructed a human head out of algae or moss. The mouth opened and closed, repeating the same call for help over and over again, while the rest of the face remained flat and emotionless. My whole body shook as I stared at the thing. Just beyond it, in the water, I saw two of those hands reaching up from the shallows, grasping for anything and everything. A cold realization came upon me. Michael must have heard that thing's calls for help and immediately suited up, only to dive in and find himself dragged under by those groping hands. This is what Ryan had meant by lures. I felt sick to my stomach as I watched the eerie face continue to yell. The cries grew quieter and more spaced out until the face became completely silent. Then, without warning, it retreated into the earth, burying itself in a thin layer of mud. I shuddered to think about that thing just beneath the surface. Then I realized that there could be more. Who knew how many of them were lurking just below me? I sprinted back to my car, disgust driving me more than fear. When I got home, I sat up all night thinking about what I saw. I managed to sleep for a couple of hours just before sunrise, but was woken by the nightmares once again. I don't know what to do anymore. There are twisted things happening here, and even if I did have the power to stop them, I don't think I want to face this darkness alone. It feels like some great puzzle and I'm missing the one or two pieces I need to bring everything together. I've packed the bare necessities into bags which now sit by my front door. I think I'm going to leave. Problem is, I don't know where I would go. I don't have family outside of town, and I don't exactly have a fortune in my savings account. Still, some part of me feels obligated to stay, both out of curiosity and because I owe it to Michael. Hell, not just Michael. I owe it to the countless people who have likely fallen victim to those things in the river. Isn't that why I took this job in the first place? I have much to think about. If this is my last post, know that I moved away and never looked back. If I do investigate further, I'll try to keep you guys updated, so long as those fucking hands don't get me first. Despite all the things that have happened, I've decided to stay here. To be honest, I fully intended on leaving as soon as possible after my last post. But that changed when I went to Michael's funeral. It was a grueling experience. He was only 22 years old. His girlfriend cried the entire time, and I couldn't help but feel guilty when I saw his young friends carrying his casket to its final resting place. His death never should have happened. I had another nightmare last night. This one was the worst yet. Just like last time, those hands reached up from the darkness and grabbed me, covering my mouth and pinning my arms to the bed. That sickening fishy smell turned my stomach and my eyes began to water as I struggled against them. Then two more hands rose up and held my eyes open. I watched in horror as a face protruded from the ceiling above me. It was like the one I had seen at the water, all green and mossy. Tears began to stream down my face as I recognized the features. It was Michael. "Why did you do this?" he said, cold black fluid dripping from his mouth. I tried to respond but couldn't pass the hands that were clasped over my face. Why, Michael went on and on, his voice becoming raspier with every query. I laid there for what felt like hours while he stared down at me and asked why I'd done this to him. I woke up in a cold sweat and could have sworn that disgusting smell still permeated my room. I'm beginning to think that this is all my fault. I should have heeded the warnings about bad water. I don't think I was the first to go there, but I was the first to see the truth of it and come back alive. Bad water isn't just well known amongst the divers. There's a variety of local legends about that part of the river, and when I think back, I recall hearing something about hands that dragged people to the water's depths. Growing up, kids would spread rumors and folk tales about bad water and the river as a whole. As I got older, I assumed they were just stories that grown-ups had made up to keep us away from the dangerous rapids. I began digging into the history of our town. Legends go back as far as anyone can remember, and even the natives told stories about the river, treating with a certain fear and reverence. I found an eerily familiar description of a native myth about the river. It was in the library's archives as part of a local university professor's thesis regarding metaphorical folklore. The myth tells the tale of a young man who lived by the river. He had everything he ever wanted: a beautiful wife, a son, bountiful harvests, and a warm place to sleep. However, that all changed when he was overcome by a terrible sickness. That same sickness spread to his wife and child. He recovered, but his family didn't, and he was left alone. He still had a warm bed at night and healthy crops, but he fell into a deep depression. Unsure what to do with himself, he would wander the river's edge for hours, silently hoping that one day he would fall in and be swept away from his troubles. One day, while pacing the riverbank, he heard his wife and child crying out for him. Frantic, he searched everywhere for the source of the voices. They began to tell him that they were living happily in the river now. His family urged him to dive in and join them so that he too could live happily. Without a second thought, he jumped in only to drown, cold and alone. The person who examined that myth believed it to be a warning against desiring things that we've lost and getting caught up in the past. I now know this isn't true. The myth is a true story and warns people against the dangers of those things that live in the river. Through further digging, I've found that there's actually a lot of native lore about the river. Many of them are similar to the story I told you about, but there are others that make this whole situation seem a lot more complex. Many of them reference some kind of god or spirit that the natives worshipped. There are a few different translations, but the most common one I've seen is King Moss. Some stories refer to him as a personification of the river itself, while others describe him as a spirit with whom the people struggled. However, one common theme is the existence of a sort of pact made between King Moss and the locals. Some stories made it sound like they sacrificed people to him in order to quell his rage, while others described a situation in which he was to be left alone in exchange for not actively hurting humans. I can't help but be reminded of the agreement that Moose and the others mentioned. Could they be referring to a pact similar to this one? I don't know about this whole King Moss myth, but after all that I've seen, I'm almost willing to believe anything. After that, I got the idea to plot out all the disappearances and deaths that have occurred in the past few decades. What I found was pretty typical. Most reports were evenly distributed around the most dangerous parts of the river as well as the areas where the most people tended to gather. However, I noticed an unnerving trend. Reports in which there was no body recovered occurred almost exclusively in the areas around Badwater as far back as the reports go. In those areas, a body was only recovered about 15% of the time. This was commonly attributed to the strong current there which supposedly carried them too far to be found. But now I know the truth. The hands got those people and dragged them down to feed. However, while doing this I noticed something even more intriguing. I was using a couple different maps to plot out the disappearances when I realized there were inconsistencies between the two. Curious, I looked at a few more maps and saw even more inconsistencies. They were all relatively similar aside from a few changes due to creeks drying up and urbanization. However, there was one area deep in the forest west of Badwater that didn't seem to match up on any of the maps. Some of them indicated nothing but a forest there, while others showed a small lake. A few of the older maps even depicted a cave system. I used Google Earth to look at the area, but something strange occurred. The picture was incredibly pixelated. Everything around it was clear, but it became blurry as soon as I toggled over to the area where the maps were inconsistent. It was still somewhat visible, but I had difficulty discerning anything other than tree coverage. I'm surprised that I'd never been there before. I've spent a lot of time wandering the forest, and I somehow never managed to stumble into that place. I'm going to check it out soon. I think this secret goes deeper than Moose and his crew. There's more to this, and I'm determined to figure it out. Wish me luck, and if I don't come back, well, just wish me luck. Fuck, I fucked up. After discovering that strange area on the maps, I decided to go there. I packed everything I thought I'd need: hiking gear, a camera to record my findings, emergency flares, and a gun. I wasn't going to let myself get caught off guard. By that point, I was determined to get to the bottom of the town's strange mystery. I headed out at about noon, deciding that it was best to do my exploring in broad daylight. I wanted nothing to do with those things that came out near the river at night, the lures as Clyde had called them. Speaking of which, there have been 3 disappearances in the past couple nights. I have no doubt that it's the work of those eerie faces. The other SAR divers have been searching relentlessly, but I've called out sick every day. I want nothing to do with Moose and his crew until I figure out what's going on. I feel a little guilty about it, but I'm hoping that my investigation will save more lives in the long run. I headed toward that strange area I had discovered, choosing to move through the densest part of the forest in order to avoid running into anyone. The hike was surprisingly long and arduous. I could hardly find my footing after all the rain we'd had. Within 15 minutes I was soaked to the bone, covered in mud, and had nearly broken my camera twice. The trip took incredibly long, longer than I expected. It seemed as if I was circling around the area without ever getting closer. I scrutinized my phone closely. I had been using it to guide me, but somehow I kept getting off course. My destination should have been directly to my east, just over a mile away. I turned in that direction and headed straight, but when I looked down at my phone, I realized that I had somehow veered north. I was a little closer to my destination but grew more distant with every step in the wrong direction. I don't know how to explain it. I just kept veering off course without intending to. This persisted for several hours, and I feared the sun would set before I even got there. But I grew closer, little by little, until finally I reached my destination. The sight of it bewildered me. A soaring rock structure stood in the center of a large clearing. The structure is hard to explain. Imagine cutting off the top 500 feet of a mountain's peak and then just plopping it down in the center of a field. That's what it looked like, an unconnected stone structure that rose to a jagged, pointy tip. It gave the distinct impression of a pyramid, though lacking the smoothness and straight angles that one would expect. A fissure in the front appeared to lead into a passageway. Strangely, a small river ran out of the cave's mouth. It only appeared to be about 10 yards wide, and it meandered across the clearing until it diverged in the woods. The water was crystal clear and flowed surprisingly fast. I followed it until I reached the mouth of the cave. I looked inside to find only darkness, the passage going back as far as I could see. It seemed to be relatively straight with no tunnels branching off. I entered the cave and noticed that the air immediately grew colder. It must have dropped at least 10 degrees from the outside. I shivered and zipped up my jacket. The river continued as far as the passage did, and I followed it as I delved deeper into the strange mountain. I noted that there were no stalactites or stalagmites in the cave. While it lacked any smoothness or markings that would indicate a man-made tunnel, it also didn't seem to be natural. The whole place had a strange air about it. I continued deeper until I was sure I must have been in the heart of the structure. At that moment, I noticed an eerie bluish light in the distance. It grew closer and brighter until I almost didn't need my flashlight. The passage grew narrower until I was just barely tiptoeing around the edge of the river. The light brightened until I suddenly found myself in an enormous round cavern. The walls were covered in thousands upon thousands of small glowing green insects. Glowworms. I had heard of caves like this in New Zealand but didn't think they existed here. However, what drew my attention sat at the center of the cavern. My breath caught in my throat when I saw it, and my hand immediately went to my gun. The river dwindled until it ended in a clear circular pool. In the center of that pool rose an enormous stone throne that seemed carved directly from the floor of the cave. It was adorned with beads, reflective stones, and precious metals. Normally I would have found it beautiful, but that beauty was ruined by what sat atop it. I can only describe it as a figure. It must have been at least 14 feet tall and sat straight, almost regal, on top of the throne. Its hands rested on the arms of the seat and a stone crown sat atop its head. Dark green moss comprised the body, much like the face I had seen by the river. Black stones sat where the eyes should have been, and they stared sightlessly down the length of the tunnel I had just come through. I shivered at the thought of that thing watching me the whole time I had been approaching it. There was no doubt, that thing was what the natives had referred to as King Moss. That's when I noticed the smell. It was disgusting, and I couldn't believe I hadn't noticed it earlier. It was exactly like the smell in my dreams, a gut-wrenching combination of grass clippings and rotten fish. I nearly vomited and tried to focus on breathing through my mouth. That wasn't much better, though. I could taste it on the air. It coated my tongue and throat, making it impossible to ignore. I covered my mouth and nose with one hand and pulled out my camera with the other. This must be the source of all the weird shit going on. This was what the native myths had talked about, and I was going to make sure everyone knew about it. I turned the camera on, pointed it at the green figure, and nothing. The image was too blurry to discern anything. There was just a mess of black and green shapes smudged across the screen. I rubbed the lens on my shirt and turned it back to the throne only to find it the same as before. I couldn't get it to display properly. I was moving to wipe the lens again when I heard a voice behind me. It won't work. I whirled around to find Moose standing there. He glared at me with a weary look in his eyes. He has a way of staying hidden, Moose said, nodding to the enthroned figure. Cameras won't work, not even film. Hell, it's a miracle you even found this place. Most people would get lost. I slowly began to reach for my gun. He noticed the motion and threw his hands up in surrender. Whoa now, he said. I mean you no harm. Yeah right, I responded. Moose furrowed his brow. Listen, you can keep your hand on that gun all you like. You can even point it at me if that makes you feel better. Just hear me out and promise not to shoot me for no reason. I kept my hand resting on the gun at my hip but nodded. You won't believe me when I say this, but I've been trying to protect you. Moose sat on the cold stone floor, looking tired. His normally clean-shaven face sported a shaggy beard and dark circles ringed his eyes. Bullshit. Just like how you tried to protect all those people down at Badwater. Moose remained silent for a moment, and his eyes took on a distant look. You have no idea how much I wish I could have. I stared at him for a moment. He seemed genuinely sad. There wasn't any malice to him. He was just a weary old man. I kept my hand near my gun but decided to hear him out. What is all this, Moose? Why couldn't you save them? He nodded to the throne once again. Do you know what that is? King Moss. The name sat heavy on my tongue. I felt as if I had just spoken something terrible into existence. He chuckled. I see you've done your reading. Yes, that's what the natives referred to as King Moss. But do you know what he is? I reluctantly shook my head. There are creatures that existed long before humans on this earth, and then there are beings that existed long before even them. He stared at King Moss. There was neither fear nor reverence in his eyes, just weary acceptance. He existed before almost anything else on here. He was ancient when the first fish took steps on land, even more so when the first settlers made their way to this place. Maybe he's a god, or maybe he's just another creature like us. All I know is that he has powers beyond fathom. You can't kill him. Moose shook his head. That thing over there isn't him. I mean, it's certainly a part of him, maybe something correlating to a head. But cutting off the head won't kill something like him. He's the river, he's the groundwater, he's the plant life in the water, he's everything. His influence extends beyond even the river. There's no stopping him. We can only abide by the pact. I remembered the agreement I had read about in the native myths as well as the one that I heard the older divers referencing. And what exactly is this pact? I'm not entirely sure of the reasoning behind it. But King Moss seems to be a lethargic sort of creature. He doesn't like being challenged, even if his challengers don't stand a chance. He just likes to sit in silence and eat. Nearly 1,000 years ago, he came to an agreement with the natives. He would mitigate his power, relegating it to certain parts of the river, and only feed off those who fell in. In exchange, the people wouldn't attack him and would let him eat in silence. One rule of the pact is that only a certain few people would be allowed to know of King Moss's existence. These people were to guard his secret and ensure the covenant remained unbroken. They were the protectors. The role was passed down generation to generation, and once the natives left, it was passed to the settlers. Clyde and Ryan are the protectors now, just like their fathers and grandfathers before them. I had trouble processing all that he had told me. This went back so much further than I could have imagined. What about you? I asked. I knew Moose had moved here when he was in his 30s. He couldn't have inherited the role of protector like Clyde and Ryan. Not long after I moved here, I was out hunting in the forest nearby. A sudden storm appeared, one like I had never seen before. I couldn't even see through the driving rain. I stumbled through the forest, looking for any kind of shelter, and came upon this place. That's when I saw him. He glared at the green effigy with disgust. I told Ryan about it the next day. That night he and Clyde planned on killing me, but then that thing spoke to them. It wanted me to serve as a protector. Apparently, something about me had caught its eye. He suddenly looked to me. You broke the pact when you came back from Badwater alive. I didn't tell Clyde or Ryan because I knew they'd kill you. But King Moss knew, and he became angry. That's why he started using the lures again. It was a warning. What can we do? I asked. Moose looked at me and sighed. You really don't get it, do you? What? It took a while for me to realize it too. He gestured to the throne. He can talk to us. It's like a voice in our heads, but not exactly words. I can't really explain it. I glanced at the creature on the throne and shuddered at the thought of it speaking in my head. Okay, so, he knows you went to Badwater, and he could have told Ryan and Clyde at any time. A cold chill ran down my spine as I began to realize what he was implying. So why didn't he? Those two aren't opposed to killing anyone who threatens the pact. Hell, they proved that just the other day with Michael. Michael, I'm sure you think it was those hands that got him, or maybe the lures drew him in. That's what the others implied to me, though I doubt it. He had overheard us talking about the little boy who went missing a few nights ago. Needless to say, some of the things he heard were incriminating. I have no doubt that Ryan or Clyde killed him and made it look like a drowning. If he had been taken by Badwater, then his remains never would have been found. They killed him. I was bewildered. I knew that something dark was happening and that the older divers were intentionally ignoring the threat that Badwater posed. But I couldn't believe they would actually go out of their way to kill another diver. Yes, Moose said. and they would kill you too if they knew you'd seen Badwater. So, the question is, why didn't King Moss tell them about you? I remembered what he'd told me about when he began working to protect the Pact. How Clyde and Ryan had tried to kill him, but King Moss had stopped them. He wants me, I said. Moose nodded. He wants you to protect the Pact. He smiled wryly to himself. I think he has a thing for divers. Suddenly I felt like the giant green figure on the throne was staring at me. It hadn't moved, but still it seemed like I was being watched. That thing wanted me. I clenched my fist. I would never work for that it. Help me kill it, I said to Moose. Or at least help me get away. Moose shook his head. I can't. Yes, you can. There's still good in you. You don't understand. He stood up and stared at me with a look of utter defeat on his face. I literally can't. He began to take his shirt off. Confused by his actions, I gripped my gun tightly. However, my grip fell when I saw what was beneath his clothes. A green mass sat in the center of his chest. Seaweed-colored veins branched off from it in every direction and faded into his skin. It pulsed like a second heart, and my stomach turned as I watched his skin stretch over it. What the fuck? This is his mark, Moose said. It's how he shows that I belong to him, and it's how he keeps me in line. I can't act in opposition to his will. It burns if I do, and it will kill me if I act blatantly against him. It's been aching ever since I found out you went to Badwater, and I can't even leave the town. It'll kill me if I go too far. What the fuck? What the fuck? What the fuck? I backed away from Moose as I muttered it over and over. Things had just gotten so much weirder. I pulled out my gun and pointed it at him. Go ahead, he said. I don't care anymore. My hand shook as I put my finger on the trigger. I stared at him for what felt like an eternity before finally letting my hand drop to my side. I couldn't do it. I'm going to leave now. The words sounded hollow. I was badly shaken by that point. Moose shrugged. Go ahead. You can't escape, though. This will all end one way or another. I ran out of the cave then, and, once out, I kept running. I stumbled through the forest in a mad dash. It's a miracle I didn't trip and kill myself. I ran until I got to my car and sped home. This will likely be my last post. I'm going to try to leave tonight. I have the bare necessities packed, and I don't care where I go. Anything is better than this. I don't know what King Moss has in store for me. If he's as powerful as Moose claims, then he might have ways of keeping me from leaving. I don't know. God, I'm scared. Wish me luck. Goodbye everyone. This will be my last post. It's all become too much. I'm sorry. After making my last post, I quickly grabbed my bags and threw them in the car. I was going to leave. I didn't really have anywhere to go. With no relatives, few friends, and a dwindling bank account, there wasn't much for me outside of town. But anything was better than what I'd seen in the cave. I wouldn't mind drifting or sleeping my car. I was sure I could find a job somewhere, just anywhere other than here. I immediately hopped in the driver's seat and headed south. I maintained a straight course, having no clear destination in mind. I wanted to get away as quickly as possible. However, as I approached the city limits, I began to feel a dull ache in my chest. The town grew further and further away, but the ache grew as the distance increased. It felt as if something heavy were pressing down on my heart and lungs. My breathing became labored, and the pain even spread to my arms. For a moment I thought I was having a heart attack, but then I remembered the thing that had been in Moose's chest. I pulled over to the side of the road. By that point it was more than just an ache. It felt like someone had hit me in the chest with a sledgehammer, and my whole body burned with a horrible, pulsing pain. I could barely breathe, and my legs shook beneath me. I yanked up my shirt and looked at my chest. The skin in the middle was raised and greenish, and dark veins radiated out from it. I watched as it pulsated slightly, just barely enough to notice. That thing was the source of the ache. My breath caught in my throat and I began to cry. I don't know how long I did so. I must have stood by the side of the road for at least 30 minutes, just a shaking, sobbing mess. It was all so overwhelming. The sudden appearance of that thing in my chest combined with the mind-numbing pain that I was feeling. After a while I managed to regain my composure and climbed back in the car, determined to get away from this thing. But the pain grew and grew until my vision began to go black. I kept going despite barely being able to see. However, after a while my vision went completely. I couldn't even drive anymore. I got out and began to walk, determined to just keep blindly moving south. But it wasn't long before my legs gave out and I laid on the hard asphalt in a pitiful state. The pain was too much. I crawled back to my car and turned around, heading back to town. As I did so, the ache lessened until it finally disappeared. At that moment, I knew that I belonged to him. There was no denying it. I don't know when it happened. Perhaps it started when I went in that cave, or perhaps it had been happening slowly all along. It really doesn't matter in the end. Over a week has passed since then. I've spent most of that time alternating between being a sobbing mess and in a catatonic state. It's all just too much. I sit in my house now, writing this. It hurts to do so, acting against him. Even writing about him incites the pain. but his hold on me isn't as strong as the others. Not yet at least. I write this because I feel that I must. The truth must be set free, though I feel there is little that can be done about it. I have come to certain realizations in the past few days. I can feel myself growing closer to him, becoming one with his mind. Perhaps the pact wasn't so bad all along, but I now know that he won't be satisfied with the pact. Moose was wrong about it all, though surely he must feel the truth now. The king isn't lazy. He was merely resting, and the pact was a method of easy sustenance until it was time for him to rise. That time is now. I can feel his cold rage and his terrible hunger. I fear for what comes next in this town and the surrounding areas. I have no idea how far his influence stretches, but if Moose was telling the truth, then he might be unstoppable. As he wakes, I can feel him becoming more sentient within my own mind. It's strange, like a second thought process that constantly underlies the first. I fear it will overtake me soon. I don't intend to let that happen. I will not let myself become a mindless servant to this monstrous creature. The thing on my chest is beginning to look a lot more like the one that was on Moose's. I tried to cut it out, but it wouldn't let me. The knife stopped inches from my skin, and no amount of effort could force my arms any further. He is part of me forever now. I fear there's nothing I can do to remove myself from him. It won't be long before we are one and the same. I have my gun with me. I intend to use it on myself. To whomever reads this, know that everything I have written is the absolute truth as I know it. Do not search for me. Similarly, do not search for this town. Only horrors await you here. Either you will be devoured by them or you will unleash them upon the greater world. I want neither of these things to occur. Just know that he exists. Know that other things like him exist in our world, and be wary. Live with that knowledge. Let it sit deep within your gut and never forget it. Do not let things end as they have. Goodbye.